Yes, there were plenty of people after the British Grand Prix to remind Lewis Hamilton that it had been 2.5 years since he had last won a round of the FIA Formula One World Championship. More significantly, though, I think this race will be remembered because it was 2.5 years since Abu Dhabi 21, since everything had happened on that day when that 8th World Championship was snatched from Lewis, effectively, on the last lap, due to a mistake made by the race director, as we now know. And it's about everything that's happened in Lewis's life since then. Teammate that he didn't really want, George Russell instead of Valtteri Bottas, and then perhaps even more significantly, a very uncompetitive Mercedes Formula One car. And yet, despite all that, over those 2.5 years, Lewis Hamilton has never lost his motivation or his drive or his enthusiasm for driving, for racing, and for wanting to continue to be the driver that he's always been, despite the road dust, despite the 7 World Championships, despite the global stardom, which long ago would have pushed most other athletes, sportsmen, into retirement or semi-retirement just to enjoy the fame and the wealth. But not Lewis. He just loves racing. He lives for racing. He's still about karting at Rye House. And we saw that as he pulled up on the grid after the formation lap, making sure that everyone knew, because of his radio transmissions, that he was going to angle his car slightly to the left, just to make sure that George knew that he was there and what he was going to do off the line. And if George didn't make a good start, then he would be in good position to get onto the racing line and lead into the first corner. Just a classic Lewis Hamilton karting thing. Not the angling of the car, because plenty of drivers do that. It was letting everybody know. That was the point. And Lewis did make a good start. He slotted into P2 behind George Russell, and for a while it looked like it was going to be, wow, Mercedes 1-2, but Max Verstappen making a really good start, passing Lando Norris when Lando ran a little bit wide coming into turn 3, getting the outside run on him, and suddenly you thought 2 Mercedes, but is this going to be a yet another Red Bull win with Max Verstappen making up for a disappointing Friday and Saturday and winning this Grand Prix going away, as kind of what you would have thought on paper, I guess, at some point. But it didn't work out that way. Max was finding it very difficult to get real feel from the Red Bull. It was a grip thing. He didn't have the same level of grip as the 2 Mercedes. And why that is, or indeed the 2 McLarens, and why that is, well, we'll have to think about that and talk about that in the days to come. We've got a little bit of time for live streams after that. But certainly in those opening laps, with full loads of fuel, everybody on medium tyres, it was a very, very difficult Red Bull for Max to drive. So anyway, enough about Max. Let's talk about those 2 Mercedes out front. It was George Russell, the pole man, leading in front of the British Grand Prix crowd. And you could sense then that providing there were no real issues with George, providing he made no mistakes, providing there were no pit stop issues, that this could well be his second win in 2 races. And he was going to win that race in front of his home British crowd. There's a long way to go, of course. And I've always said that it's been a good thing that Mercedes haven't, in a way, had such a competitive car since Abu Dhabi 21. Because had they done so, had that car been a lot quicker, it would have been absolute fireworks between Lewis and George Russell, particularly if there was a world championship to fight for. That isn't the case. And that wasn't the case at Silverstone today. This was very much a special occasion for George, for Lewis, and for Lando. And you got the feeling that they weren't treading on one another's toes any more than they needed to, and that there was a lot of mutual respect between those 3. And I think there was that mutual respect as well from Max towards those 3 drivers at their home race. I mean, it sounds odd to say it, but just get that feeling. Certainly the passes and repasses you had with Lando Norris would indicate that to be the case. Anyway, getting back to the front, Lewis matching George in everything he did, no doubt thinking, I'm going to have to beat this guy somehow. Maybe it'll be the pit stops. Maybe it'll be when the rain comes. And that's indeed what happened. McLaren and Mercedes, meanwhile, have been really good on full tanks as well. Both Lando and Oscar Piastri passed the ailing Max Verstappen in the Red Bull RB20. Seems very odd to be saying that, but he did. And it was a beautiful pass by Lando going into Stowe with the help of DRS. Similar pass 2 laps later by Oscar Piastri. And Max just looked to be going into a zone of just bringing this car home. The best he's going to be able to do would be probably P5 if everybody finished and nobody made any more mistakes. There are a couple of things still to be mastered in this Grand Prix. And the first of those, of course, was the weather. And the second was the subsequent pit stops and making the right call with the weather. The rain did start to fall when they were on slicks. And when that happened, Lewis Hamilton closed on George Russell even more and got past him going into Stowe. George making it quite easy for Lewis to go down the inside. And then on top of that, the 2 McLarens started to catch the 2 Mercedes. And just after Lewis had gone past the pits in the lead of the British Grand Prix, he ran wide at turn 1. So did George. And Lando at this moment took that opportunity to pass George Russell. He was still having to filter in behind Lewis Hamilton, getting on the radio saying the way they rejoined the track was unfair, but there was no stewards' inquiry. That was a good thing because it wasn't that unfair. I think there was a lot of room, and Lewis and George did that correctly. But it was a big moment, and it was a big moment as well in the pits, of course, for everybody to be seeing that and how greasy this track was with everybody on slicks. And it was 2 laps later, indeed, in front, effectively in front of the McLaren pit, certainly going into turn 1, that Lando Norris pulled out and passed Lewis Hamilton in the wet on slicks going into turn 1. And very quickly, McLaren were running 1-2. Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, from Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. The first to blink, to come in for intermediates, because the weather was now really bad and it was getting greasy, was Max Verstappen. No surprise there, because Max didn't have anything like as much to lose in terms of track position. He was P5. He was unlikely to finish lower than P5, unless Carlos Sainz really got it together in the other Ferrari. And Max did very well with that on lap 27. He gained a lot of time on the first 3 runners, who were, of course, still on slicks. They all came on the following lap to switch to intermediates, although Oscar Piastri had to wait a further lap because there'd been a problem, of course. There was a potential problem with stacking, and he would have lost too much time behind Lando's pit stop. So that was Lando leading from Lewis Hamilton. Max Verstappen had managed to get past George Russell by coming in a lap earlier. And George's race very soon would be over with some sort of water system drama. Very strange in Formula One context, let alone in Mercedes factory context. But George unbelievably pulls into the pits, walks out of the car and out to the back of the garage. Desolate, obviously. On the pole for the British Grand Prix, he'd led the race from the start, and now he was in early retirement. Then the sun came out, and then some decisive moments as well. Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen and Oscar Piastri all came in on the same lap. And on this occasion, Lando Norris went 1 lap longer. It had been Oscar before in the previous round of pit stops. Now it was Lando running an extra lap. And all of them, of course, were coming in to switch to slick tyres. So by the time Lando was coming in, they were saying to him on the radio, Lewis Hamilton has gone to soft tyres. You can do that and cover him. Or you can cover Max Verstappen, who's gone to hard tyres, by going on the medium tyre. And Lando went for the soft to cover Lewis Hamilton. Just shows how much Lando wanted to win this race. A good call, probably in retrospect even. And if he would know that Lewis Hamilton on that soft tyre would be able to go the full Grand Prix distance, he would have imagined that, of course, the McLaren would be able to do the same thing. Anyway, he came in, and it was a long, delayed pit stop. He came out now in 2nd place behind Lewis Hamilton. And Lando was to say later in the cool-down room before the podium ceremony that even if he'd made a brilliant pit stop and he'd come back in the lead, he still didn't think he would have won that race because his tyres quite quickly went off. It was the left front, that was the fragile part of the tyre wear at Silverstone. No surprise there. A lot of right-handers, a lot of load through the left front, quite a lot of load through the left rear as well, but mainly through the left front. These are all medium fast corners doing the damage. But Lewis Hamilton was leading the Grand Prix because of that slow pit stop on the McLaren. And Max Verstappen on the hard tyre now, for the first time that afternoon, actually feeling that he had some sort of grip level around which he could drive the car. And with the hard compound, of course, he could push as hard as he wanted without any risk of those tyres going off or degrading. Whereas it was a different story at the wheel of the Mercedes and the McLaren. And it's possibly because Lando was in the turbulence of the Mercedes that his tyre wear was greater, that his tyres went off sooner, there was more temperature, the left front went away. Certainly Lewis also had to massage the left front, but he didn't have anything like the same deterioration of grip as Lando. And as a result of that, Max quite efficiently and quickly caught Lando Norris and passed him into Stowe Corner, another DRS pass. So Lando was effectively out of it. Oscar Piastri was effectively out of it because he had to do an extra lap because of that stacked pit stop situation. And now it was down to 2. It was down to Max Verstappen versus Lewis Hamilton. Abu Dhabi 21, retribution. There were so many thoughts going through so many minds, I think, at Silverstone, a huge crowd there. We've lived through other huge crowds at Silverstone, and we've lived through Grand Prix wins by British drivers, notably David Coulthard, Damon Hill, and of course Nigel Mansell in front of these sorts of crowds at Silverstone. But this was different. This was a crowd that was not only willing Lewis Hamilton on in a Mansell-esque way, but this was also a crowd, probably in terms of the majority, that had lived through Abu Dhabi 21 as well. And I think that's what made the difference. This was a huge emotional groundswell around the circuit. And Lewis for sure could feel it, could see it. And a couple of times on the radio when Pete Boddington said things like, Lewis, this is, we can do this. You're on the right compound. Keep going. Lewis would say, don't worry, mate. I got it. And the control he had in his voice and the confidence said everything you needed to know. but slowly, 1/10 per sector, 2/10 per sector, couple of tenths, 3/10 per lap, Max Verstappen began to close the gap on Lewis Hamilton. And the mathematicians on the pit wall began to work out potentially how close he would be when the checkered flag came out. He would be within 1 or 2 seconds, assuming the deterioration on the left front was linear, and assuming Lewis didn't make any mistakes, and assuming there were no extraneous dramas as well. Big assumptions. Max kept his head down, incredibly consistent, always quicker around the circuit than Lewis Hamilton, catching him. He too could feel the crowd, but he closed, and everybody was on tenterhooks. I think everybody in the crowd was standing at this point. Lewis Hamilton, could he win the British Grand Prix? His first win since Abu Dhabi 21. He could, and he did it. He was resilient under pressure. He made no mistakes. He was polished. And I think his drive today was not only greater than the sport itself in terms of what he did, the imprint he's made globally as an athlete. I think this will be going right around the world on the news services, let alone the sports services. But I think it was also a classic Lewis Hamilton win, because I talked yesterday about the way he was letting the car float into Beckett's very high speed. We're talking 300 kilometers an hour entry into that corner. And he's letting the car float in 8th gear. The revs are coming down a bit, whereas George was putting it into 7th sooner, getting the torque of the engine to lean on, working the tyres a little bit harder. Lewis would never do that. He's got that Prost-like touch of mechanical sympathy and not leaning on the engine too much. And I think we saw in the wet today, when he caught and passed George, we saw the beauty of that ability to be able to float into a corner with half throttle, no brakes, just half throttle, letting the car feel its place on the road, squarely on the road. And I think that was where he caught George. George's concern at that point about rising water temperatures notwithstanding. And I think his win today was partly a function of that touch and feel. And I think it was also the way he was able to massage the car in terms of looking after the left front. What does that mean? It means that you've got to use the rear a bit more in order to protect the left front. And that's a very subtle thing to be able to do. But Lewis did it. He did it absolutely superbly with all the talent, the natural talent in his fingertips, in the small of his back, in his elbows, wherever it is that he's always had ever since those karting days. And that was what this win was all about. It was about that sort of level of touch and feel. And you could see it going to Copse Corner with the TV angles that they had, quite low down, head on. You could see the beautiful transition of Lewis going on a slightly earlier corner than, say, George Russell. And similarly, Max, absolutely identical in the Red Bull. These two class drivers showing what they do absolutely at the peak of their ability in this situation which we now found ourselves in the last 10 laps of Silverstone. Strange how a lot of Grand Prix this year have come down to the last 10 laps. But anyway, this was the last 10 laps. And they were just beautiful laps to watch, I think, in the case of both Lewis and Max and the way they were driving. Max could lean on the car more, but he was in no way ragged, and he was just quick, remorselessly quick. And for sure, Lewis could see him in his mirrors. Whether he's looking in his mirrors was another matter. I doubt it, knowing Lewis. And he won that race. Earlier today, a couple of hours before the race, my friend Cameron sent me a WhatsApp saying, "So Peter, who do you like for today's race?" I had no doubt at all that this was going to be a Lewis Hamilton day. And I said, yeah, Lewis. And I said that because of the quality of the lap he drove yesterday. Yeah, it didn't give him the pole. And yeah, he may have had a tad more downforce or things like that. But ultimately, what we saw from Lewis yesterday was incredible touch and feel against an ultra quick driver, a little bit spikier driver, George Russell, but we saw Lewis almost matching him with his just wonderful touch and feel, even at this age, even after all these years, even after all those world championships around a circuit like Silverstone. And on the basis of that lap yesterday, you had to feel that this was going to be a Lewis Hamilton day. Lord Lewis Hamilton. Sir Lewis Hamilton's not enough. I think the crowd would probably would agree with that. I don't think there's anything after a Lord. There probably is. But anyway, definitely Sir Lewis Hamilton. What a day. And for me, in some ways, yeah, that was so emotional to see Lewis after the race. He was obviously crying throughout the slowdown lap. And the embrace with his dad was very long, very, very long embrace. But why not? This was a human victory, far bigger than the normal things we see in Formula One. This was an enormous achievement. And Lewis deserves every bit of slack we can give him in terms of his emotions and what that race meant to him, what that win meant to him. Of course, it doesn't compare with winning that 8th World Championship, but that's gone now. This is the next best thing, for sure, to win the British Grand Prix of all races, 2.5 years on from Abu Dhabi. For me, maybe the nicest thing, the thing I'll remember most about that race was when he got out of the car and he put on his cap. I know there's been a lot of Lewis Hamilton merchandise with the Mercedes brand over the years, but I've never seen that one, the white sections, but the basically green and yellow. And green and yellow makes me think of Lotus 49s, Lotus 33s, makes me think of Jim Clark. And I have no doubt at all that if Jimmy had been with us today watching that race, he would have said that was a win.